The archive station was old, very old, the kind of old that made the walls creak even in the silence of deep space, where there was no wind to push them and no reason for them to make any sound at all. The lights inside flickered every few minutes, not because anything was broken, but simply because the station had been running so long that even its electrical systems had grown tired. Thessaly Vorn did not mind the flickering. She had been working in dim and strange places for most of her academic life. She had 4 eyes, 2 large ones in front and 2 smaller ones on the sides of her wide, flat head, and all 4 of them were perfectly capable of reading in low light. It was one of the small advantages of being an Ethan in a galaxy full of species who needed bright rooms and loud machines to feel comfortable. She sat in a narrow chair in front of a terminal that was older than her grandmother, scrolling through file after file of cartography records. Her fingers moved quickly. Her 2 front eyes were fixed on the screen. Her 2 side eyes wandered around the room out of habit, watching for nothing in particular. She was supposed to be here for routine work. The Conclave Cartography Guild, the organization that employed her as an intern, had sent her to this decommissioned archive station on the edge of the Drenvar system to recover old survey files and transfer them to the new central database. It was boring work. It was the kind of work that was given to interns precisely because it was boring, and no senior cartographer wanted to spend 3 weeks floating in a dead station copying files. Thessaly had not complained. She liked old things. She liked quiet places. And she liked, more than almost anything else, the feeling of finding something unexpected in a place where nothing interesting was supposed to exist. She found it on the 9th day. It was buried under 12 layers of standard survey archives, dust accumulation reports, gravitational drift logs, routine stellar mapping files that hadn't been opened in over 200 years. She almost missed it. Her finger was already moving to the next folder when something caught the attention of her lower left eye. A file name that didn't match the others. Everything else had long system-generated codes full of numbers and dashes. This file had a name. It was called Prime Survey Original Do Not Transfer, Do Not Copy, Do Not Read. Thessaly stared at it for a moment. She read it. In her defense, anyone would have. The file took nearly 4 minutes to open. The station's processor was old, and the file itself was enormous, far larger than any survey document had any business being. When it finally loaded, Thessaly leaned forward without thinking, her front eyes widening. It was a map. But it was not like any map in the Conclave's current database. The maps she worked with every day had a blank gray region near the outer edge of the western spiral arm. Every map had it. It was simply there, like a hole in a page, and nobody talked about it much. The notation along its border said the region was uncharted, and that surveyor access had been suspended under something called Conclave Directive 1 Prime. Thessaly had seen that notation hundreds of times. It had never interested her. Lots of regions were uncharted. Space was large. But this map, this old, hidden, do-not-read map, did not have a gray region. It had stars. Hundreds of them. Bright, detailed, fully mapped stars with names and coordinates and population data, and atmospheric readings and notes about resources and trade potential. An entire civilization's worth of stellar geography, mapped out in careful detail by surveyors who had clearly spent enormous time and effort doing their job properly. And at the center of all those stars, in letters that were bold and clear, and had clearly survived multiple attempts at deletion that had all somehow failed, were 2 words. Human space. Thessaly sat back in her chair. She looked at the screen for a long time without moving. Then she looked over her right shoulder. Then her left. Then she checked both side-eye views out of pure reflex, even though she already knew the room was empty and the station had no other inhabitants. She looked at the screen again. Human space, she said out loud very quietly to nobody. The station hummed and flickered. She did not close the file. She knew she should have. The file had 3 clear warnings on it, and one of them used the word forbidden in 4 different languages. Thessaly had always had a complicated relationship with warnings. She respected them in the way that someone respects a very large dog. She took them seriously. She did not provoke them carelessly, but she also did not simply walk away without understanding what she was dealing with. She started reading. The survey data was old, older than she had expected. Some of it dated back over 1,000 years, to the early expansion period when the Conclave was still young and its member species were still learning to work together and map the galaxy with shared tools. The earliest entries were simple: a few scout probes sent into the western spiral arm, returning data about a yellow star and a small rocky system orbiting it. Standard findings. Nothing alarming. Then the notes changed. The scout probes sent to the third planet of the yellow star detected something unexpected: radio signals. Structured ones. The kind that only came from thinking beings. This was not unusual in the early Conclave era. New species were being discovered regularly. The surveyors had logged it with professional excitement and flagged it for contact protocol. The contact protocol sent a larger ship. The larger ship came back with a report that Thessaly read twice before she was sure she understood it correctly. The species on the third planet, which called itself humanity and called its planet Earth, was friendly. It was curious. It wanted to communicate, and it did so quickly and well once both sides worked out a shared language. It had no faster-than-light travel yet, but its people were clearly intelligent and its technology was advancing fast. None of that was the problem. The problem was everything else the surveyors had found. Because Earth, they reported, was not what any of them had expected. It was not the technology that unsettled the early surveyors. Humanity's technology was young by galactic standards, interesting, occasionally creative, but nothing that could threaten a conclave exploration vessel. It was not the size of the human population, which was large for a single planet species but not extraordinary. It was the wars. Humanity, the surveyors reported with the kind of careful, measured language that people use when they are trying very hard not to sound frightened, had been at war with itself for its entire recorded history. Not small conflicts, not border disputes between city-states. The survey team had accessed human historical records, and what they found inside those records was something that most surveyor teams never encountered on a first contact mission. Humanity had fought wars that covered the entire surface of its planet. It had developed weapons capable of ending all life on Earth and then chose, on at least a dozen occasions throughout its history, not to use them. Not because it couldn't, because it decided not to. The distinction was noted in the surveyor's log with 3 exclamation points, which was unusual for a professional document. Humans healed from injuries that would kill most species, not because they had extraordinary medicine, though they did develop medicine quickly, but because their bodies were, in the words of the survey team's biology specialist, stubbornly difficult to stop. A human could lose large amounts of blood and still function, could survive temperatures that would incapacitate most conclave species, could go without sleep or food for periods that the biology specialist described as genuinely alarming. They also ran, not away from things, though they did that too, but for no reason at all, just for the activity of it, sometimes for very long distances over very difficult ground. The biology specialist had spent 6 pages of the report trying to explain this and had eventually given up and written, "They appear to enjoy it. I do not have a better explanation." Thessaly scrolled through page after page of this. Hours passed without her noticing. The early survey team had not recommended conquest or avoidance. They had recommended careful, slow contact. Let humanity develop. Watch it grow. Introduce it to the conclave gradually, in stages, giving it time to adjust to the knowledge that it was not alone in the universe. It was a good recommendation, a sensible one, the kind of recommendation that experienced people make when they have thought carefully about a situation. It was never followed. Instead, 200 years after the first contact file was written, there was a different entry in the archive, shorter, more formal, written in the dry, official language of conclave administrative decree. It was the original text of Directive 1 Prime, and it said, in summary, the following. All survey activity in the western spiral arm region designated as human space was to be suspended indefinitely. No conclave vessel was to cross the border into human space without express permission from the Conclave High Council. All existing maps of human space were to be reclassified and removed from public circulation. The region would be marked as uncharted on all standard charts. There was no explanation, no incident report attached, no reason given, just the directive signed by 17 High Council members, every one of whom had written their signature with the kind of firm, deliberate pressure that suggested they were very certain about what they were doing. Thessaly searched the archive for an explanation and found, instead, something almost worse. Nothing. No record of what had happened. No report of an incident. Just a gap, a clean, deliberate, carefully maintained gap, where the reason should have been. Someone had removed it so completely that even the removal itself had been removed. She leaned back in her chair and pressed two of her hands against her face, which was what Ethans did when they were overwhelmed. "What happened to you?" she whispered to the map. The map did not answer. The lights flickered, the station hummed. She spent the next 2 days going through everything in the archive that was even slightly connected to the western spiral arm, or to anything that might have triggered Directive 1 Prime. She found fragments, pieces of things, an old diplomatic communication from a species called the breth that mentioned recent activities near the outer arm border, without saying what those activities were. A navigation update that rerouted 3 major trade lanes away from human space with no explanation, beyond a reference number that pointed to a file that no longer existed. A biology research paper from a conclave medical university that had been citing a study on human physiology. The citation was still there, but the study itself had been removed. It was like reading a book where someone had cut out every page that contained the most important parts of the story. But there were smaller things, things that had been left behind, perhaps by accident, perhaps because whoever had done the cleaning had grown tired or careless near the end. A surveyor's personal journal, appended to the back of an otherwise empty administrative file. A single paragraph in a diplomatic memo that had survived because it was buried at the bottom of a much longer document about something completely unrelated. The journal entry was from a surveyor named Sel Tavar, and it was dated roughly 800 years ago, well after Directive 1 Prime had been issued. It read, "Passed near the border today, did not cross, nobody crosses, but I could see 2 of their ships from the observation deck, long, heavy things with shapes that don't match anything in the design catalog. They didn't hail us, didn't come toward us, just sat there on their side of the line, watching. I asked the captain if we should report them. She said we should look away, set a course for Drenvar, and never speak of this again. So I'm writing it down instead, because I don't think things that are real should disappear just because someone is afraid of them." Thessaly read the entry 3 times. The diplomatic memo paragraph was shorter, written by an ambassador whose name had been redacted, addressed to the Conclave Trade Committee roughly 300 years ago. It said only, "I strongly advise against any further economic actions targeting human space. We do not fully understand what we are dealing with, and I do not think we want to. Some borders are drawn not by walls but by wisdom. This is one of them." On the 3rd day, Thessaly did something she had been putting off because she knew it would make everything harder to ignore. She cross-referenced the star data from the hidden map against the current public charts. The calculation took her terminal most of the morning. When it finished, the results sat on her screen in plain numbers that were very easy to understand. Human space, based on the original survey data, contained 412 star systems. The majority had planets. Many of those planets had been flagged in the old surveys as inhabited, or capable of being inhabited, or already showing signs of development. Humanity had been a spacefaring species for at least several centuries by now, based on the development timeline in the early contact files. 412 systems. An entire civilization. Sitting right there on the western edge of the known galaxy, behind a gray patch on a map, while the rest of the conclave went about its daily business and quietly, carefully, collectively refused to look. Thessaly saved a copy of the original map to a personal drive, tucked the drive into the inner pocket of her work jacket, and then sat for a long time thinking about what she was going to do next. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to finish her transfer assignment, pack her tools, file her routine report, and go back to Conclave Central Station and never mention the archive file to anyone for the rest of her life. She thought about the surveyor named Sel Tavar who had written things down because they deserved to be real. She thought about the clean, deliberate gap where the reason for Directive 1 Prime should have been. She thought about 412 stars and the civilization living among them that the rest of the galaxy had agreed, without ever having a meeting about it, to simply pretend did not exist. She closed the terminal, she packed her tools, she filed her routine report. She kept the drive in her inner pocket all the way back to Conclave Central Station. And she started asking questions. The first thing Thessaly learned, once she began asking carefully, quietly, in the way that she had learned to ask things when she wanted answers and not just polite refusals, was that she was not the only one who knew. There were others. Not many, and they did not talk openly, but they existed, older cartographers who had noticed the gray patch and been told to leave it alone, historians who had found fragments of the old survey records and quietly set them aside rather than report them, a retired conclave diplomat who had been stationed near the western arm early in her career and who, when Thessaly found her and sat across from her in a small tea house on Verath Station and asked a careful question, went very still for a moment and then said, "You found the archive file?" "Yes," Thessaly said. The old diplomat looked out the tea house window at the docking bay beyond it, where ships came and went in the ordinary business of a busy station. She was quiet for a long time. "Then you know there are stars behind the gray patch," she said finally. "Yes." "And you want to know why we don't go there?" "Yes." The old diplomat looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent a very long time being careful about something and is now weighing, in real time, whether to stop being careful. "I can tell you what I know," she said, "but I want you to understand something first. What I know is not the whole story. What anyone knows is not the whole story. The whole story is behind that gray patch, and it has been there for 800 years, and the reason no one has gone to get it is not because they couldn't." She paused. "It is because every time someone seriously considered it, someone else in the room who was older and wiser and had seen more of the galaxy would look at them very quietly and say, 'I wouldn't.' And that was always enough." Thessaly leaned forward. "But why?" she asked. "What is over there that frightens an entire galaxy into silence?" The old diplomat picked up her tea. "That," she said, "is exactly the right question, and I am very sorry to tell you that answering it is going to take more courage than either of us might have." She drank. The station hummed around them. Somewhere outside, a ship was powering up its engines, preparing to go somewhere mapped and known and safe. Thessaly kept her hands very still on the table and thought about the drive in her pocket, and the map on it, and the 412 stars that were waiting, in the gray patch, for someone brave enough to look. The old diplomat's name was Senna Rao, and she had seen more of the galaxy than most people twice her age. She had worked border stations, trade negotiations, first contact follow-ups, and the kind of quiet diplomatic missions that were never written up in official records, because they went wrong in ways that no one wanted to explain later. She had white ridges along the back of her neck that turned pale when she was stressed, and for the entirety of her first conversation with Thessaly Vorn, they were very pale indeed. She did not tell Thessaly everything at once. That was not how Senna Rao did things. She told things in layers, like someone carefully removing old bandaging from a wound slowly, watching for the flinch, adjusting the speed based on what she saw. The first layer was this. The gray patch had a name among the older diplomatic corps. They called it the quiet border. Not human space, not the uncharted region, not anything that appeared in any official document. Just the quiet border, spoken in low voices in private rooms, always with a small pause before and after the words, the way you might speak the name of something you respected enough to handle carefully. "Why quiet?" Thessaly asked. "Because nothing loud has ever come out of it," Senna said. "No broadcasts, no territorial claims, no aggressive movements, no demands, complete silence from their side and complete silence from ours by agreement." She tilted her head. "Though I always thought the name was a little dishonest. Quiet suggests peace. What it really means is that both sides are very deliberately not making noise." "Both sides," Thessaly repeated. "So they know about us, they know we're out here." Senna gave her a look that said this was perhaps the most obvious question she had ever been asked. Of course they know. They have known for centuries. They were the ones who detected the Conclave's early survey probes. Their astronomers identified our ships before our ships identified their planet. She paused. They have simply chosen, as we have, not to make a formal event of it. "Why?" "That," Senna said, "is what I am going to try to explain to you, and I want you to understand that I am not entirely certain my explanation is correct. I am only certain that it is the closest thing to correct that I have found." She started with the Vreth. The Vreth hegemony was not today a major power in the Conclave. It occupied a modest set of star systems in the Eastern Arm, was known primarily for its shipbuilding industry, and participated in conclave politics with the quiet, unremarkable efficiency of a species that had learned, at great cost, not to reach too far. But 800 years ago, the Vreth hegemony had been the dominant military force in the known galaxy. It had the largest fleet, the most advanced weapons, the most aggressive foreign policy, and it had, roughly 8 centuries in the past, decided that the Western Spiral Arm, including whatever was inside the gray patch, belonged to it. The Vreth fleet that crossed into human space numbered 4,000 warships. Thessaly had read a fragment of this in the archive, but Senna had more detail, drawn from sources she declined to name, and documents she described only as very old and very private. The fleet crossed the border on a clear mission: survey, claim, and if necessary, conquer. The Vreth were experienced at this. They had done it 6 times before with other species and other regions, and it had always worked out in their favor because the Vreth were disciplined and organized, and had more firepower than anything they had ever encountered. What happened next was recorded by the single Vreth ship that came back. The humans had no fleet of comparable size. What they had was smaller, older, and by all technical measurements significantly less advanced than what the Vreth had brought. They should have, by any reasonable military calculation, simply lost. They did not lose. What the Vreth records described, in language that Senna said became increasingly strange and agitated as the account progressed, was that the humans simply did not behave the way an outnumbered force was supposed to behave. They did not retreat to defensible positions and sue for terms. They did not surrender when their losses became severe. They did not follow any of the tactical patterns that the Vreth military strategists had built their models around, because all of those models were built on the assumption that at some point, a losing side would accept that it was losing. The humans did not accept this. They fought in small groups and large groups. They adapted their tactics mid-battle, sometimes in ways that the Vreth commanders described as making no logical sense, and then 3 hours later turned out to make terrible sense. When one approach failed, they tried something different. When their ships were damaged, they kept the damaged ships in the fight rather than pulling them back. When their pilots were exhausted, they fought exhausted. Senna paused here and looked at Thessaly carefully. The Vreth Admiral's personal log was part of the document set I read. He was not an emotional man. He had fought in 7 campaigns and was famous for his cold judgment. But there is a section of his log, written on the 6th day of the engagement, where he describes watching a single human vessel, a small one, heavily damaged, one of its main drives clearly dead, continue to maneuver and fight and refuse to retreat or go silent. And he wrote, "I do not understand what keeps it moving. By every measure I have, it should have stopped. But it has not stopped. It will not stop. I am beginning to think it will not stop until there is nothing left of it at all. This is not how war is supposed to work." Thessaly sat quietly. The Vreth fleet withdrew after 3 months, Senna continued. They had lost more than 3,000 ships. The humans had lost more proportionally because they had less to begin with, but they were still fighting when the Vreth turned around, still fighting. She let that sit for a moment. The surviving Vreth ship reached home carrying the survivors of the campaign and a physical note on actual paper, written by hand. It said, and this I have memorized because I think it is one of the most important sentences ever written in the history of the galaxy, "We have returned your people. Please don't do this again. From Earth." The tea house was very quiet. Outside, ships moved in the docking bay, going about their ordinary business. "Please don't do this again," Thessaly said softly. "A threat," Senna said. "Not a demand, not a declaration of war or a list of terms, just a request, polite, almost gentle." She picked up her tea, found it was empty, and set it down again. The Vreth never went back, and when other species learned what had happened, and they did learn because these things always spread, even when everyone is trying to keep them quiet, they decided, one by one, that the western spiral arm was perhaps a part of the galaxy that didn't need exploring. The second story was about the Solin Merchant Collective, and it was different in character, but in some ways even more disturbing. The Solin were traders. They had no interest in conquest. What they had interest in was control, specifically, the kind of control that came from managing the flow of goods and resources across large regions of space. When they identified human space as a region they didn't control, their response was not military. It was commercial. They simply rerouted every trade lane that passed near human space, cut off any conclave merchant who attempted to do business in the Western Arm, and issued quiet notices to their partners, suggesting that commerce in that direction would be commercially inadvisable. It was, Senna explained, a very sophisticated economic stranglehold, the kind that the Solin had used before to bring entire systems into their commercial network. It worked by isolation, cut a region off from trade, watch its economy weaken, and eventually they come to you. The Solin embargo of human space lasted 6 months. In those 6 months, humanity did not weaken. What it did instead was, in Senna's words, deeply confusing to everyone who watched it happen. The humans looked at the disruption to their trade and treated it as a problem to solve rather than a crisis to survive. Within 2 months, they had established their own internal trade network across their 400 star systems, faster and better organized than the fragmentary one they'd had before, because the embargo had forced them to sit down and actually build something solid. Within 4 months, they had identified conclave worlds that were also being poorly served by Solin trade routes and had found ways to offer them better terms, not through aggression, but simply by being cheaper and faster and more reliable. Within 6 months, they were undercutting Solin prices on 12 core worlds, and the Solin had gone from choking human space to watching their own market share quietly disappear into the Western Arm. The Solin ended the embargo without announcement or explanation. They simply stopped, rerouted their trade lanes back the way they had been, and began a period of quiet, internal reorganization that their economic historians would later describe as a necessary recalibration. Thessaly found herself almost smiling. They tried to strangle humans economically, and the humans accidentally improved their own economy in the process. Not accidentally, Senna said, and she did not smile. That is what you must understand. It was not luck. It was not accident. Every single thing the humans did during that 6-month period was a direct, practical response to the situation they were in. They looked at a problem and they worked on it. And they did not stop working on it until it was solved. And then they kept going because once they were working, they found other problems nearby that were also worth solving. She leaned forward slightly. The Solin are very intelligent beings. They are patient and strategic and have centuries of experience in commercial warfare. What they were not prepared for was an opponent who looked at their strategy, a strategy specifically designed to create despair and submission, and treated it as an interesting challenge. There were smaller stories too, and Thessaly collected them over the days and weeks that followed her first conversation with Senna. She found them in fragments and pieces, in the way she had learned to look for things quietly from the sides, without asking direct questions that made people shut down. A Kreth deep survey drone that had been lost in a navigation error and crossed the border into human space. It came back 3 months later, not just found, but repaired. More than repaired. Several of its systems had been upgraded with modifications that the Kreth engineers who received it did not recognize and spent the next several years studying. Attached to the drone, secured with care to the outside of its hull, was a small sealed container. Inside the container were objects that took some time to identify. Small, round, brown-baked objects made from a grain product mixed with a form of processed sugar crystal, and something the Kreth food chemist called a fat derivative of likely animal origin. The note attached to the container said only, "Found your drone, fixed some things, thought you might like these. Station crew, Outpost 7. The Kreth engineers ate the cookies cautiously, and then, reportedly, ate all of them. The modifications to the drone were eventually incorporated into 3 generations of subsequent Kreth survey vessel designs. There was the story of a conclave passenger liner that had suffered a catastrophic navigation failure near the border and crossed 3 light-years into human space before its emergency systems managed to stop it. Human ships had reached it within hours. They had provided power, medical assistance, and enough supplies to get the liner home. They had charged nothing. They had asked for nothing. The only thing they had requested was that the liner captain confirm the names and home worlds of all passengers, which Senna said had confused everyone until someone with enough historical knowledge pointed out that the humans appeared to be checking whether any of their own people were aboard. A habit, apparently, of never leaving their own behind if they could help it. There was the story of the border incident near the Tenvar Reach, when a conclave military patrol had misjudged its position in an ion storm and found itself facing a human defense station. The patrol captain had expected confrontation. What she got instead was a patient, clear communication on an open channel in perfect conclave standard language, offering to help the patrol navigate out of the storm and back to its correct position. The station operator had even provided updated weather data for the region as a courtesy. None of these stories were in any official record. They lived in the personal accounts of the people who had been there, passed from ship crew to ship crew across generations, growing a little with each telling but never losing the quality at their core, which was the quality of something true. It was Senna, at their third meeting, who gave Thessaly the piece that connected all the other pieces. "You have been asking the wrong question," Senna said. Not unkindly, she said it the way a good teacher says it, with enough gentleness that it landed as information rather than criticism. Thessaly looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You have been asking what humans have done that frightens the galaxy. You have been collecting the incidents, the Vreth fleet, The solin, embargo, the drone, the liner, and looking for the common threat. The weapon, the capability, the thing that makes them dangerous. Senna shook her head. But that is not what the stories are about. Thessaly waited. The Vreth fleet did not turn back because humans were too powerful to fight. They turned back because they were too exhausting to fight. Because fighting them felt like fighting something that would simply never end, and that feeling was more frightening than any weapon the humans actually carried. Senna folded her hands on the table. The Solin did not end their embargo because they were beaten. They ended it because they were outworked by a civilization that looked at a serious problem and treated it as something interesting rather than something hopeless. The drone was not sent back as a show of power. It was sent back because humans found a broken thing and their instinct was to fix it. The liner was helped not because humanity wanted something in return, but because there were people in trouble, and that, to a human, is simply a reason to act. She paused. The white ridges on the back of her neck had gone a little paler. What the galaxy is afraid of, she said, is not what humans will do to us. It is what they are, the way they are made. They are made in a way that does not include stopping. They do not stop when things are hard. They do not stop when they are losing. They do not stop when they are tired or afraid or badly outnumbered. They stop when the problem is solved, and not always then, because sometimes they get interested in the next problem while they are still finishing the last one. She looked at Thessaly with steady eyes. And the terrifying thing is that this is not aggression. It is not even ambition in the way we understand ambition. It is just how they are. It is what they do. The way water flows downward is what water does. The way humans persist is what humans do. And the galaxy looked at this, 800 years ago, and quietly agreed that whatever lived behind the gray patch was something we should leave alone, because we had no framework for dealing with something that simply would not stop. The tea house was quiet for a long time after that. Thessaly thought about Sel Tavar and the two ships he had watched from the observation deck that nobody wanted him to talk about. She thought about the clean gap in the archive where the reason for Directive 1 Prime should have been. She thought about all the small stories and the big ones, and how they all pointed in the same direction. Someone should have talked to them, she said finally, properly, a long time ago. Senna looked at her. The expression on her face was complicated, something between agreement and the deep weariness of someone who had thought this for a very long time. Yes, she said quietly, someone should have. Outside, the docking bay lights were shifting to the station's evening cycle. Somewhere in the galaxy's western arm, behind a gray patch on a map, 412 stars were circling their suns, and the civilization among them was doing what it had always done, working, building, solving problems, and waiting, perhaps without even knowing it was waiting, for the rest of the galaxy to finally decide it was ready to come and say hello. Varath Central Station was the largest station in the Conclave's Western Transit Network. It sat at the junction of 7 major trade routes, serviced over 300 ship arrivals and departures every standard day, and had a population of roughly 90,000 permanent residents, alongside a rotating population of travelers that pushed the total headcount to somewhere around 150,000 on a busy cycle. It had been built to handle surprises. It had docking bays that could receive ships of almost any configuration. It had a diplomatic wing with translation services in over 2,000 languages. It had a security force, a medical facility, a commercial hub, an administrative tower, and a communications relay powerful enough to reach the other side of the known galaxy in under an hour. Nothing about its design had prepared it for what happened on an otherwise perfectly ordinary morning, at a quarter past the 7th hour of the station's clock cycle. The arrival alarm, a gentle tone, nothing urgent, the kind that went off 100 times a day, chimed in docking control, and Operator Second Class Fenris Kahl looked up from his terminal to check the approach data on the incoming vessel. He looked at the data. He looked at it again. He looked around the control room to see if anyone else was looking at their screens, and found that two of his colleagues were, and that both of them had gone very still. "Fen," said his colleague Prate in a very careful and controlled voice, "are you seeing what I'm seeing?" "I'm seeing it," Fenris said. "It's a ship." "It is a ship, yes." "Coming from the direction of the western arm, yes." There was a silence in the control room that was not actually silent because all the equipment was still running, but felt silent because everyone in it had stopped making any sound at all. "It's broadcasting," said the third operator, Liz, staring at her screen with her head tilted as if that might help her understand what she was reading. "Wide spectrum, open channel, all frequencies." She paused. "It's a greeting." The ship that was coming toward Varath Central Station was large enough to be significant, but not so large as to be aggressive. It was built, and this was the first thing the station's analysis systems noted and could not quite categorize, in a way that suggested it had been built by people who were deeply practical and not particularly concerned with how it looked. There were sections that were clearly older than other sections. There were external modifications, extra plating in some areas, additional antenna clusters, equipment housings bolted to the hull that didn't match the rest of the design, that suggested ongoing modification over time rather than a single planned construction. The engine's signature was unusual, efficient, clearly capable, but running in a configuration that no Conclave ship database could match. The registration code it was broadcasting was one that no Conclave registry contained. The language in its greeting was Conclave standard, perfect, clear, entirely unaccented, which was, on its own, enough to make the translators sit up straight because it was not what you expected from a species making first contact. First contact species did not speak your language. First contact species needed months of careful communication work before you could even exchange basic information. First contact species were not supposed to already know you well enough to address you clearly in your own tongue on their first approach to your station. The greeting said, "Varath Central Station, this is the vessel Persistence, Registry Human Exploration Service out of the Sol system. We are approaching on a friendly heading and request docking permission. We carry no weapons in a ready state. Happy to answer questions. Please advise on your preferred docking bay." Control Room 7 had 17 people in it when the greeting came through. By the time the message had been confirmed and reread, there were 31, because word had spread through the control wing in approximately 90 seconds. Fenris Call, who was technically the officer on duty, spent 45 seconds staring at the message on his screen, and then did the only sensible thing available to him. He kicked the decision up to his supervisor's supervisor, which was a person named Director Olin Kess, who arrived at Control Room 7 4 minutes later looking as calm as a person can look when they have just been told that a human ship is asking for a parking space at their station. Director Kess read the message. She read it twice. She looked out the observation window at the approaching shape of the Persistence on the long-range display. She pulled up the analysis data. She looked at her staff, all of whom were looking back at her with expressions that said, very clearly, "Please tell us what to do." Director Kess had been working in station administration for 38 years. She had handled engine fires, medical epidemics, diplomatic incidents, a docking bay flood caused by a malfunction in a water recycling system, and one memorable occasion when a trader had brought an uncontained specimen of a species that turned out to be venomous and highly mobile into the commercial hub. She had never handled this. "Assign them Bay 47, she said, because Bay 47 was large, isolated, had its own atmospheric systems, and was far enough from the main residential sections to give everyone a little space. Get me the diplomatic wing on the line. Get me Security Chief Vara. And someone tell Thessaly Vorn." Thessaly was in her office in the cartography section when the message came through, and she arrived at Bay 47's observation level at roughly the same time as the Persistence finished its docking approach. She had been waiting in some form for something like this. She had known it was coming, not in the way of prophecy, but in the simple logical way that when you pull a thread long enough, the thing it is attached to eventually arrives. She had been pulling threads for 8 months. She had built a file of fragments and stories and second-hand accounts and old diplomat memories, and she had understood, in a way that she suspected most people around her had not yet caught up to, that the gray patch was not a stable situation. Things that are kept quiet do not stay quiet forever. They stay quiet until they don't, and the moment they stop being quiet, they stop very suddenly and completely. What she had not entirely expected was him. The Persistence settled into Bay 47 with the easy competence of a ship whose crew had done this thousands of times. Docking clamps engaged. The airlock cycled. The bay's atmospheric processors hummed as they worked to equalize pressure and composition. And then the airlock opened, and Commander Eli Marsh walked out. He was, by any measure Thessaly had expected to apply, unremarkable. He was medium height, shorter than she was, though Ethan's tended toward the tall end of the bipedal range. He was broader through the shoulders than most species she dealt with, which she knew was a common human characteristic, but it was less imposing in person than in the biology reports she had read. He had dark hair, cut short, and a face that was weathered in the way that faces got when they spent a lot of time on ships and in places with variable atmospheres. He was carrying a large travel mug with a handle on it, the contents of which steamed slightly in the bay's air, and he was wearing a dark jacket that had a tear along the left sleeve that had been roughly repaired at some point and then partially retorn. He walked out of the airlock and stopped. The observation level above Bay 47 had, in the 11 minutes since his arrival had been announced on the station's internal network, accumulated somewhere between 300 and 400 people. Not security staff. They were present but standing back, per Director Kess's instructions. Just residents and travelers and workers who had heard that a human was docking at Bay 47 and had decided that whatever they had been doing was less important than seeing this. Marsh looked up at them. They looked down at him. He looked around the bay. He looked at the airlock he had just come through. He looked at the security staff standing at a respectful and very careful distance. He looked back up at the observation gallery of several hundred aliens who were watching him in complete, profound, barely controlled silence. He raised the travel mug in what Thessaly recognized, from her reading, as a human gesture of acknowledgement. "Hi," he said, in conclave standard, in a voice that was calm and clear and carried through the bay without effort. "We've noticed nobody visits. We figured we'd come say hello." He paused and looked around the bay again, apparently checking for something. "Is there a customs form I should fill out?" The next 4 hours were the most carefully orchestrated chaos that Verath Central Station had ever produced. Director Kess handled it with the steady efficiency of someone who understood that the correct response to unprecedented situations was to apply very normal procedures to them as quickly as possible, because normal procedures were calming for everyone involved, including the unprecedented situation itself. Marsh was escorted, at a distance that started at 10 meters and gradually, cautiously decreased, to the diplomatic wing, where he was met by Ambassador Second-Tier Doral Veth, who had been stationed at Verath for 6 years and was generally considered unflappable. Veth sat across from Marsh at the diplomatic table and was, for the first time in his career, flappable. Thessaly got herself into the room by the simple method of telling 3 different people that someone else had already cleared her presence there. It was not strictly ethical. She was not strictly sorry. She sat at the far end of the table and watched. Marsh set his travel mug on the table, which was an antique piece of conclave diplomatic furniture worth more than most small ships, and which had never in its history had a travel mug set on it, and looked at Ambassador Veth with a direct, open expression that Thessaly found herself cataloging carefully. He was not nervous. That was the first thing. Not performing calm, actually calm, in the deep-down way of someone for whom this situation, however unusual, was simply a problem to be worked on, and problems were things he was accustomed to. He had lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time in expressions of concentration or amusement, and at the moment it was not entirely clear which one was operating. "I want to be clear up front," he said to Ambassador Veth. "We're not here to make demands, issue statements, or start anything that needs a treaty. I am specifically authorized to have a conversation and not much else. The conversation can be about anything you want." He glanced around the room. "Though I notice you've got a cartographer in the back, so I'm guessing some of this is going to be about the map." Every head in the room turned toward Thessaly. Thessaly felt all four of her eyes widen. "We know about the gray patch," Marsh said, without looking away from the ambassador, but with a tone that suggested he was entirely aware of the cartographer's reaction. "We've known for a while. We thought it was funny at first. Then we thought it was a little sad. Then we just let it be, because it seemed like you needed it to be that way and we had other things to work on." He picked up his travel mug and took a drink. "But there's a generational thing that happens, I think. Somebody who was alive when the original decision was made, they have a reason for the rule. They understand why. But 10 generations later, you've got people following a rule whose reason nobody remembers, and that's when things start to go sideways. Because a rule without a reason is just a habit, and habits are harder to fix than decisions." Ambassador Veth had recovered his composure sufficiently to ask, "Are you suggesting that the current situation, the border arrangement, is unsustainable?" "I'm suggesting it's a little silly," Marsh said pleasantly. "No offense intended. I'm sure whoever set it up had good reasons. But right now you have, 40 million species in the conclave, and every one of them is walking around a gray patch on a map without really knowing why, and we're on the other side of that gray patch doing the same thing, and it would be genuinely useful for everyone if we just had a conversation." He paused. "Also, we've been picking up some of your distress signals from ships that get into trouble near the border, and we keep helping, but we have to do it secretly, and it's getting logistically complicated." There was a long silence. "You have been helping ships in distress," Ambassador Veth said slowly, "secretly." "For about a century," Marsh confirmed. "It's not a big operation. We just, if somebody's in trouble and they're nearby, we help. It seemed like the right thing to do." He looked mildly puzzled by the expression on the ambassador's face. "Is that a problem?" Thessaly left the meeting 3 hours later with her head full of things that needed organizing. She went to the cartography section's small break room, made herself a drink, and sat down and wrote a list. The list had 2 columns. The first column was headed "What I Expected," and the second was headed "What Actually Happened." The first column was long. It had items about difficult negotiations and veiled threats and careful diplomatic language, and the kind of slow, guarded exchange of information that characterized every first contact in conclave history. The second column had 1 item. He asked about a customs form. He said it would be useful for everyone. He has been secretly helping ships in trouble for 100 years because it seemed like the right thing to do. She stared at the 2 columns for a while. She thought about everything Senna Ral had told her, and about the stories she had collected over 8 months, and about Directive 1 Prime and the clean gap in the archive, and 412 stars behind a gray patch. She thought about what Senna had said. What the galaxy is afraid of is not what they will do to us. It is what they are. She had understood that sentence when Senna said it. She had thought she understood it completely. But sitting in the break room with a list that had 1 item in the second column, she understood it better. Because what made Eli Marsh quietly, genuinely, fundamentally unsettling was not that he was frightening. It was that he was completely ordinary. He was a person sitting across a diplomatic table, drinking something hot from a travel mug with a torn sleeve, asking practical questions and making practical observations, and being, in every visible way, simply a person who had a job and was doing it. And somewhere behind the gray patch on the map, there were billions more of him. All of them working, all of them persistent, all of them looking at the galaxy's gray patches, its blank spaces, its avoided questions, its rules without reasons, and asking in calm and reasonable voices whether it might be useful to actually talk about this. Thessaly finished her drink, put down the list, and went back to the diplomatic wing. She had questions, and for the first time in 8 months, there was someone she could ask them to directly. The diplomatic wing of Vereth Central Station had 12 meeting rooms. They ranged from large, formal chambers with high ceilings and symbolic lighting arrangements designed to communicate equal standing between delegations, all the way down to small, plain rooms with round tables and no decoration at all, which were used for conversations that needed to be honest rather than ceremonial. Eli Marsh chose one of the small rooms. He said he preferred round tables because nobody had to sit at the head and spend half the meeting wondering what that meant. Ambassador Veth had looked at him for a long moment after this statement with the expression of a diplomat who had spent 30 years navigating the significance of table geometry and was now being asked to set all of that aside. He managed it with grace and joined Marsh at the round table, and Thessaly sat across from them, both with her recorder and her 4-page list of questions, the first of which she had rewritten 14 times to make sure it was not going to come out wrong. She asked it anyway, and it came out slightly wrong, which she suspected was unavoidable. "How long have you known?" she said. Marsh looked at her. It was, she had noticed over the past day, a specific kind of look, not unfriendly, but very direct, the kind that communicated that the person behind it was paying close attention and not going to pretend they weren't. "How long have we known about the conclave? About the gray patch? About the fact that we deliberately left you off the map?" He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated because it meant he was actually considering the question rather than giving her a prepared answer. "Officially, about 300 years. There's a record in our public archives of an astronomer who noticed that the survey probe traffic from the galactic east had stopped, and that the last probe came from a specific direction, and then there were no more. She worked out what it meant that someone had made a decision to stop coming and filed a report with what passed for our government at the time." He took a drink from his ever-present travel mug. "The report didn't cause a crisis. People talked about it for a while and then went back to work, which is what we tend to do. It didn't frighten anyone. Some people were worried about it. There was a theory for a while that we'd done something wrong, that you'd found us dangerous and decided to quarantine us. That theory had a decent following for a generation or two, but it didn't really hold up because if you wanted to quarantine us, you'd have done something more active than just not coming back. You just stopped, and the stopping felt more like backing away than boxing us in." He tilted his head. "It felt like we'd scared you somehow. And that felt strange to us, because from where we were sitting, we were the ones who were outnumbered." Thessaly wrote something in her notes. "But you still didn't come to find out." "Not officially, no. We were busy." He said it simply, without apology or irony, and Thessaly believed him completely because she had spent 8 months learning about what humanity had been doing in its 412 star systems for the last 8 centuries, and the answer was, a great deal. We had planets to settle, systems to develop, a lot of internal problems to work through. And there was a feeling, not a policy, just a feeling, that whatever was on the other side of the line had decided they didn't want to meet us, and pushing people who don't want to be pushed wasn't something we needed to do. And the ships you've been helping." He shrugged slightly. "That was never official policy either. It's just, if you see someone in trouble and you can help them, you help them. Some of our people near the border made that call individually over the years, and it became a habit. We never announced it because we figured it would cause more problems than it solved." The conversation went on for 2 hours, and Thessaly asked questions and Ambassador Veth asked questions, and Marsh answered all of them with the same direct, unfussy honesty that she was beginning to think was simply the way he communicated, not a diplomatic technique, not a practice style, but a genuine preference for saying the actual thing rather than the safe version of the thing. She asked about the Vreth fleet. He nodded slowly. "We knew it was coming before it crossed the border. Long-range detection. There was a lot of internal debate about what to do." He paused. "Some people wanted to send a diplomatic signal before they arrived. Some people wanted to wait and see if they stopped at the border. Some people wanted to prepare a full military response immediately." He looked at his mug. "The people who wanted to wait won the argument, and the Vreth didn't stop at the border, so the military response happened anyway." 4,000 warships, Ambassador Veth said quietly. "It was a large fleet," Marsh agreed. "We had less. What we had were people who understood the territory and had a reason to be there that the Vreth didn't have, and who were willing to keep going past the point where a rational calculation would tell you to stop." He was quiet for a moment. "We don't like losing people. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a glorious thing. It was ugly and it cost a lot, and there are memorials on 16 worlds that list the names. But the alternative was losing the systems those people lived in, and the people who were in them and everything they were building, and that wasn't acceptable." He looked up. "So they didn't stop, and eventually the Vreth decided it wasn't worth continuing." "The note," Thessaly said, "please don't do this again." Marsh nodded. "That was a line commander named Hana Yu. She was on the ground operation on the third planet. When the Vreth fleet started withdrawing, she found the ship they were using for prisoner transport, got the prisoners out, put them back on the Vreth ship, and wrote that note herself. She had very neat handwriting, apparently. It's in a museum now." He paused. "She thought it was important to be polite about it. She said you shouldn't make people feel more humiliated than necessary when they're already leaving." Ambassador Veth looked as if this piece of information was doing something complicated to his understanding of the universe. "She thought about their feelings after they invaded." "She was that kind of person," Marsh said. Thessaly asked, eventually, the question she had been building toward. Not the question about the Vreth fleet, or the Solin embargo, or the drone, or any of the specific incidents she had spent months collecting. The question underneath all of those questions, the one that Senna Ral had told her was the right one, back in the tea house on the day that had started all of this. "What are you?" she said. "Not politically, not militarily. What are humans in a way that helps me understand why an entire galaxy decided to leave you alone?" Marsh was quiet for longer than he had been quiet for any previous question. He set his travel mug down and looked at it for a moment, and she had the sense that he was not performing thoughtfulness. He was actually thinking, turning the question over, looking at it from different sides. "There's a word we use," he said finally. "Stubborn. It means not stopping when things are hard, not because you're not aware they're hard, not because you don't feel it, but because the thing you're working on is more important than the difficulty, and so you keep going." He looked up. "Every species is stubborn about some things, but for humans it's less about the specific thing and more about everything. We get interested in something and we don't stop being interested. We make a promise and we keep tracking it even when it's become inconvenient. We meet a problem and something in us turns toward it instead of away from it, even when turning away would be easier." He leaned back slightly. "The other thing is that we're curious in a way that doesn't turn off. There are species that are curious until a thing becomes dangerous, and then the curiosity stops because survival overrides it. For humans, and I'm being honest here, not boastful, the danger doesn't turn off the curiosity. It changes it. It makes the curiosity more focused. A human who is told that is dangerous, don't go there, tends to want to understand why, and that wanting is stronger than the fear." He paused. "This has gotten us into a lot of trouble historically. It has also gotten us out of a lot of trouble, because the same drive that walks you toward the danger, is the drive that keeps you working on the solution after everyone else has given up. Thessaly was writing. Ambassador Veth was very still. "Is that why you're here?" Veth asked, curiosity. "Partly," Marsh said, "and partly because there are 800 years of missed conversations in the way and someone had to start. We figured, why not us? We're good at starting things." He picked up the travel mug. "Also, we kept picking up fragmentary signals from your side of the border that suggested someone over here had found some of our old survey files and started asking questions. We thought, if someone is brave enough to ask the questions, the least we can do is show up to answer them." He looked directly at Thessaly. She had all four eyes on him. "You picked up my research signals," she said. "We're very good at listening," he said. "We've had a lot of practice." Over the days that followed, a pattern developed that nobody had planned for and nobody knew quite how to manage. Marsh was not confined to the diplomatic wing. This had been Director Kess's decision, made on the logic that confining him would suggest they were afraid of him, and suggesting they were afraid of him seemed like a dynamic best avoided. So he was given a guest suite, a general access pass, and a polite request to inform someone if he intended to leave the station, and he was allowed to go where he wished within Verath Central's common areas. He went everywhere. Not aggressively, not nosily. He moved through the station with the easy manner of someone who was genuinely interested in his surroundings and made no particular effort to hide this. He asked questions of anyone who seemed willing to answer, about the station's systems, about the trade routes that passed through it, about the history of the Drenvar system, about what different species ate and what they did for work, and how their home worlds looked from orbit. He was not a broad, sweeping questioner. He asked specific, thoughtful things, listened to the answers carefully, and then asked better follow-up questions. He also, as people around him quickly discovered, fixed things. It started small. A water recycler in the residential section that had been making an odd sound for 3 weeks. He heard it, asked what it was, traced the sound to a specific coupling joint, borrowed a tool from a maintenance worker who happened to be passing, and corrected the coupling in about 4 minutes. The maintenance worker watched this with the expression of someone who had been meaning to get to that coupling for 3 weeks and felt simultaneously grateful and vaguely outclassed. Then it was a piece of cargo analysis software in the commercial section that was producing a recurring error in its weight calculations. Marsh happened to be present when a dock worker was staring at the error message with the expression of someone who had been fighting a machine all day and was losing. He looked at the screen, asked 2 questions, and identified the source of the calculation error. Not a software problem, but a calibration issue in a sensor module that fed data to the software, which nobody had thought to check, because the software's error message pointed to the software. Then it was a navigation display in the public transit section that was showing slightly incorrect route times due to a relay station that had drifted off its mapped position. Marsh caught it because he was looking at the display while waiting for a transit pod, noticed the times were wrong based on what he knew about the transit distances involved, asked a nearby station worker about it, and the station worker took the information up the chain, and the relay station was corrected within a day. "He keeps fixing things," Director Kess said to Thessaly, in a tone that was not quite complaint and not quite amazement but sat somewhere between the two. "I know," Thessaly said. "Nobody asked him to fix them." "I know. He just sees them and fixes them." "That," Thessaly said carefully, "seems to be how they work." On the 5th day, Marsh asked if he could see the cartography section. Thessaly took him herself. She showed him the current databases, the active survey projects, the map displays that showed the known galaxy in all its detail. He looked at everything with the specific attention he gave to anything that interested him, and said very little, and she let him look without rushing him. Eventually he stopped in front of the large main display, the one that showed the whole western arm, with the gray patch sitting in its corner like a missing tooth in a smile. He stood in front of it for a long time. "It's strange," he said finally, "seeing yourself on a map as a gray nothing." "I'm sorry," Thessaly said. She meant it. He glanced at her with an expression that was not wounded, just human, in the complicated way she was learning that word worked. "Don't be, I get it. From the outside we must look unpredictable, maybe a little alarming. If I were mapping a region and I didn't understand what was in it, I'd probably leave it gray too." He looked back at the display. "But it'd be better with the stars." "Yes," she said, "it would be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small data chip. He held it out toward her. "Our survey data," he said. 412 systems. Every star named, every inhabited world cataloged, atmospheric data, population estimates, resource surveys, the whole record. It's not classified on our end, anyone can have it." He looked at the gray patch. "It'd be a shame for it to stay gray." Thessaly took the chip very carefully, with both of her front hands, the way you take something that has been a long time in coming. "I'll see that it goes to the right people," she said. "I know you will," he said. "That's why I gave it to you and not the ambassador." On the 7th day, Senna Rao came to the station. Thessaly had sent her a message, 3 lines, carefully written, that said only, "The question has been answered. I think you should come and meet the answer." Senna had arrived the next morning on the early transit and found Thessaly waiting for her at the docking gate with an expression that was hard to read, but that Senna, who was good at reading people, interpreted immediately and correctly as I was right, and I knew it, and I am trying very hard not to say so. Thessaly brought her to the small, round table room, where Marsh was eating something he had obtained from the station's food service, and reading something on a small handheld screen. He looked up when they came in. He looked at Senna for a moment with those attentive eyes. "You're the one who knew," he said, "the one who's been carrying this for a long time." Senna stood very still. "You know about me. We picked up fragments. You were stationed near the border early in your career. You've been doing careful, quiet work on this for decades. We noticed." He stood and held out his hand, a human greeting gesture that Senna, who had done her homework, recognized and accepted, clasping her hand around his in the way he offered it. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting it stay forgotten." Senna looked at him for a long moment. The white ridges on her neck went through 3 different shades in rapid succession, which Thessaly recognized as the Ethan equivalent of a very emotional response being very carefully managed. "I had a colleague once," Senna said finally, "a long time ago. She told me that some things stay quiet not because they should, but because everyone around them is afraid. And she said the only answer to that was to not be afraid, to keep asking." She paused. "I was not always brave enough, but I kept going." Marsh looked at her with an expression that was warm and genuine, and completely uncomplicated. "That," he said, "is the most human thing I've ever heard anyone who isn't human say." The data chip that Eli Marsh had handed to Thessaly Vorn was approximately the size of her thumbnail. It weighed almost nothing. She had set it on her desk when she returned to the cartography section that evening, and she had sat across from it for a long time, just looking at it. 412 star systems, on a piece of material she could have lost in a coat pocket. She transferred the data to the Cartography Guild's secure intake server and filed a formal acquisition report, which was the standard procedure for receiving new survey data. The intake form asked for the source of the data. She wrote, "Human Exploration Service, Human Space, Sol System." She clicked Submit. The form went up the chain. The response came back in 40 minutes, which was faster than the standard processing time, and it came back from 3 levels above where it should have been acknowledged, which told her that somebody in the senior cartography administration had been watching the flag on her account ever since word got out about the persistence arriving at Bay 47. The response said, "Please hold this data pending review by the Senior Verification Committee." Thessaly looked at the response. Then she looked at the 8 months of work stacked in her personal files. the fragments from the archive station, the stories from Senarau, the fragments of old diplomatic memos and survey logs and personal journal entries, all the pieces of the real story that had been sitting behind the gray patch waiting for someone to put them together. She wrote back, understood, review process estimate. The answer was undetermined. She closed the reply window and did what she had learned to do from Eli Marsh. She set aside the part of the problem she could not move right now and found the part she could. She started building the new map. It was not simple work. Survey data from an independent civilization did not simply drop into a conclave cartography database without significant processing. Coordinate systems needed to be reconciled. Naming conventions needed to be standardized, or at least cross-referenced. Marsh had told her that humans had their own names for almost everything, and that they tended to be either very practical, second settlement, new harbor, or deeply strange by non-human standards, threshold, morning, the place where we tried again. The atmospheric and population data needed to be formatted to conclave standards. Thessaly did this work for 2 weeks, while the Senior Verification Committee met and deliberated and sent her careful, formal messages asking careful, formal questions. She answered the questions thoroughly. She provided her documentation. She sent copies of the archive files she had recovered from the decommissioned station, including the original survey data and the original text of Directive 1 Prime. She also, through channels she did not advertise, sent copies to Senarau and to several historians and diplomats at other conclave institutions, whom she had come to trust through her months of research. Not because she was planning anything, just because she had learned, watching the gray patch for 8 months, that information that lives in only one place has a way of disappearing. Marsh, for his part, was still on the station. His authorized stay had been extended 3 times now by Director Kess, who had initially seemed uncertain about his presence and had gradually moved to a position of something that looked very much like finding him useful. The water recycler coupling had been the beginning. The list of things he had identified and fixed since then had grown, and he had also, in his direct and practical way, started asking questions about the station's larger systems. The cargo routing algorithms, the docking scheduler, the atmospheric management protocols, with the specific quality of attention that suggested he was not just curious about how they worked but was looking for ways they could work better. He never pushed. He never demanded. He simply looked at things, thought about them, and then mentioned in a conversational way what he had noticed and what he thought might be worth considering. Director Kess, 3 weeks into this, had quietly given him an unofficial advisory role and then spent a full day pretending she hadn't. "He has been here for 4 weeks, Ambassador Veth said to Thessaly during a corridor meeting that was really a scheduled consultation dressed as a coincidence. He shows no signs of wanting to leave." "He's working," Thessaly said. "On what?" She thought about it. "On things that need doing." The Senior Verification Committee issued its finding after 3 weeks of deliberation. The finding was long, formal, and written in the dense administrative language of official conclave documentation. Thessaly read through it in under an hour, which was fast only because she went directly to the conclusions section and then worked backward through the reasoning only as necessary. The committee found that the survey data submitted by the Human Exploration Service was authentic. It found that the coordinate and formatting work Thessaly had done was correct and sound. It found that there was no technical obstacle to incorporating the data into the standard conclave cartographic database. And then it noted, in careful and measured language, that the decision to update publicly distributed maps with this data was not a cartographic decision. It was a political one, and it needed to be made by the Conclave High Council. Thessaly forwarded the finding to Senarau, who forwarded it to the 3 council members she knew personally, with a cover letter that Thessaly had helped write, and that was the most carefully worded document Thessaly had ever been part of composing. Every sentence had been tested for the ways it could be misread. Every argument had been checked against the counterarguments that could be used against it. Senna had 40 years of diplomatic experience and Thessaly had 8 months of obsessive research, and together they made a document that was very difficult to argue with. The council took 11 days. During those 11 days, Thessaly finished the new map. She finished it completely, every system labeled, every star named in both Human Exploration Service Convention and Conclave Standard, every inhabited world noted with its population estimate and primary industries, and the name it used for itself. She added the trade routes that Marsh had described, the FTL lanes that humanity had developed independently and used among its own systems for decades. She built the map at full resolution, the kind of resolution that the Conclave Cartography Guild used for its premium published charts, the ones that hung in public buildings and government offices and the viewing decks of major stations, large enough to read from across a room. She also left the gray patch in. She left it as a reference, a ghost of the old map, faintly visible beneath the new data, so that anyone looking at it could see both what had been there before and what was actually there. She thought that was important, not to forget the gray patch, to remember it as a choice that had been made for complicated reasons and had lasted 800 years and had finally, by slow and careful work, been set aside. The Conclave High Council's decision came on a Tuesday, which was not a significant day on any species calendar. It was issued as a formal administrative update, the kind of routine notice that went out dozens of times a day across the Conclave's communication network, updating policies, clarifying procedures, issuing routine directives. This one retired Directive 1 Prime. No ceremony, no announcement, no press conference or public statement, just a short administrative notice that said the directive was rescinded and that Cartography Guild resources were authorized to update standard charts to reflect current survey data for the Western Spiral Arm region. That was it. 800 years of gray patch, and it ended with 2 paragraphs in an administrative notice. Thessaly was in her office when it came through. She read it twice. She sat for a moment. Then she opened the map she had built and flagged it for publication. She sent a copy to Senna. She walked down 2 corridors to Marsh's temporary office. He had an unofficial space in the logistics section now, a small room with a round table that Director Kess claimed was not permanent, but that had somehow accumulated a full complement of tools and a second chair and a second travel mug that was clearly there for guests, and knocked on the open door. Marsh looked up from what he was working on. "The directive is retired," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not triumph, not vindication, but something quieter than both. "Good," he said. "The map goes out tomorrow. Full distribution across the Conclave network. Every station, every ship, every terminal." He nodded slowly. "Would you like to see it?" she asked, "before it goes out?" He put down what he was working on and stood up. She showed it to him on the main display in the cartography section, the same display they had stood in front of on the day he gave her the chip, the one that had shown the gray patch in its corner like a missing tooth. The gray patch was gone. In its place, the western spiral arm was fully populated with stars, hundreds of them, bright and named and interconnected by routes and lanes, and the small notations that told the story of a civilization that had been building quietly for centuries. Human space was no longer a blank. It was a place, fully real, fully mapped, fully there on the chart of the known galaxy in exactly the same way as everything else. Marsh stood in front of it for a long time. Thessaly stood beside him and did not say anything, because there are moments that belong to the person having them, and the best thing you can do is give them space. He reached up and touched the edge of the display lightly with 2 fingers, a star near the center of the human systems. The display identified it, Sol. The yellow star. The first one the early conclave surveyors had found 1,000 years ago, when the signal from the third planet had caught their attention and set the whole long story in motion. "Earth," he said quietly. "Earth," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he dropped his hand and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was simple and direct and very human in the specific way she had learned that word meant, not complicated or hidden, just a genuine feeling clearly felt. "Thank you," he said, "for not leaving it gray." "Thank you," she said, "for coming to say hello." The new map went out across the conclave network the following morning at the start of the first hour of the standard clock cycle, arriving on terminals and displays and public charts across hundreds of star systems simultaneously, the way important updates did. Most people who saw it that day noticed only a small change to a region of the western arm that had previously been uncharted. Many of them looked at it briefly and moved on, because they had work to do and it was early. Some people looked longer. A navigation officer on a long-haul freighter out of the Creth systems stared at the update for several minutes before calling her captain, and the captain came and stared. And then they stood together looking at the western arm and all its new stars, and said nothing for a long time because there was a lot of nothing to say and nowhere to begin. A history professor at the conclave's largest university called 3 of his colleagues before he had finished his morning drink, and spent the next 4 hours on calls that kept being interrupted by other calls from other people who had also seen the map and wanted to talk about it. An elder member of the Breth diplomatic service, 93 years old and retired, saw the map on the public display in the common room of her residence block and sat down in the nearest chair, and did not move for some time. She had been a junior diplomatic aide when she was young enough to have spoken once to a diplomat who had spoken once to someone who was in the room when the fleet came back with the note. She had carried that story her whole life, turning it over occasionally, wondering. She looked at the map for a long time and thought about the note, and about the line commander with the neat handwriting who had thought it was important to be polite, and she thought, 800 years. It took us 800 years. And then she thought, better late than never. The conclave's formal contact protocols with human space were established over the following 18 months, in the careful and deliberate way that significant things were done. Trade agreements were negotiated. Diplomatic missions were established. FTL routes between human space and the conclave's eastern networks were mapped and certified. Humans, true to everything Thessaly had learned about them, did not wait for the protocols to be finalized before getting involved. Human engineers appeared at conclave infrastructure projects before anyone had formally invited them, looking at systems with interested eyes and mentioning, helpfully, that they had a few ideas. Human merchants showed up at border stations with goods that turned out to be in high demand and competitively priced, having done their market research quietly in advance. Human explorers filed survey requests for regions the conclave had marked as too hazardous to investigate, apparently finding this description more interesting than discouraging. The conclave adapted. It had little choice, but the adaptation was not unhappy, which was something that the historians who later wrote about this period noted with interest. There was no conflict, no crisis, no moment of confrontation or threat. The gray patch became a door, and the door opened, and on the other side was a civilization of stubborn, curious, relentlessly helpful people who had been waiting a long time for a conversation and were very ready to start one. Thessaly Vorn was promoted twice in the year following the map update. She did not particularly pursue the promotions, but she did not refuse them either, because they came with larger offices and better access, and both of those things were useful. She kept working on the border regions. There was still a great deal of cartographic catch-up to do in the Western Arm, and she was the person in the guild who understood it best. She collaborated with the Human Exploration Service on a joint survey project that mapped 11 previously uncharted systems along the old border corridor. She wrote 2 papers that became widely cited, though she was better at writing papers than reading citations and rarely checked. She kept in contact with Sena Rao, who consulted on the early diplomatic framework and retired shortly afterward, and sent Thessaly occasional messages from wherever she was traveling, which was usually somewhere interesting, and usually involved finding some old record or fragment that needed to be understood. She kept in contact with Marsh, who did not stay on Varath Central indefinitely. He had eventually submitted his report to the Human Exploration Service, been recalled briefly to Sol for what he described as a lot of meetings, and then sent back out on the Persistence on an expanded mission to continue what had become, officially, the largest human diplomatic engagement in centuries. He sent her data from time to time, not personal messages. He was not a particularly expressive communicator in writing, but survey data, notes on systems he had passed through, occasional observations about things he had noticed in conclave space that seemed worth thinking about. She sent back corrections to his coordinate notations, because he had a persistent habit of using the Human Exploration Service system when conclave standard would be cleaner, and she was a cartographer, and this bothered her professionally. The map that Thessaly had built was published in full print edition by the Conclave Cartography Guild 6 months after its digital distribution. The print edition was a large format chart, the kind that was made to be displayed, not folded, on heavy material that would last a long time. She received a copy. She framed it and hung it in her office. It was the first map of the full known galaxy that included human space at proper scale, with all 412 systems named and mapped and sitting in the western arm in their correct positions, connected to the rest of the galaxy by routes and lanes, and the invisible threads of a civilization that had been there all along, quietly working, waiting for the gray patch to become a place. In the lower right corner of the map, beneath the legend and the Cartography Guild seal, the notation that had once bordered the gray patch had been updated. Where it once read, Region Uncharted, Surveyor Access Suspended, see Conclave Directive 1 Prime, it now read, Human Space Open Border Note, they will help you if you ask. They will also help you if you don't ask. This is simply what they do. She was looking at the map on the afternoon it arrived, standing in front of it with her morning drink, thinking about 8 months in an archive station and old files, and the drive in her jacket pocket, and all the slow, careful work that had led to this particular Tuesday afternoon, when she noticed something she had not noticed before. In the lower left corner of the map, beneath the compass rose, in the small white space beside the scale bar, there was writing. Small, neat, done in a dark marker directly on the printed surface of the map, not printed as part of the design, written by hand after the fact on the actual physical copy she had received. She put down her drink and leaned close. It said, "Nice work on the map. Took you long enough, E. Marsh." She had no idea how it had gotten there. She did not ask. She stood back and looked at the map, all of it, the whole known galaxy with human space sitting in its proper place in the western arm, fully real, fully mapped, fully part of the picture. She never took it down.